So we're in your government book. We're in chapter 6 onto the third section, and we're talking about the power. First, we were talking about the powers of the president, and now we're getting into the president's roles. And one of the roles of the president was the chief of state, and that was basically the chief of state being that dignitary to actually stand as a president in the inaugural address and in the State of the Union onto receiving dignitaries. That's a chief of state, kind of like a king or queen position. And then on to the second was the chief executive. And we talked about the chief executive and those powers that the president has as the chief executive. And we went over those powers as the first of all being the ordinance power, and that's to give executive orders, that power without the Senate's approval in certain situations. And the ordinance power is given like to call out, to call out the National Guard, or to call out in certain cases, as President Eisenhower did at Brown versus Board of Education in Little Rock. And then going on to the power to seek advice from his cabinet. We went over that. And now onto the power to pardon. We talked about the power to pardon, which he had to pardon crimes that were committed against the federal government, or to shorten their sentence or lower their crime or give them amnesty. Onto the power of appointment. And we talked about the powers of appointment given in the Constitution. Basically were given to the president, the vice president, the president-electors, and the members of the House and the Senate. They're given power from the Constitution. But the president's given special powers to appoint a lot of different staff members and a lot of different employees, including his White House staff, and onto ambassadors, foreign diplomats, members of the cabinet, chief assistants, federal judges, United States attorneys, United States marshals, heads of the independent government agencies. All these people, the president has the power to appoint. Most of these have to be under the consent of the Senate. The Senate has to okay them. So not the House of Representatives, but the Senate. So that's where we got to of these important appointees. But the most important of all of these would be the appointment of the Supreme Court justices, because when it gets to that point, the Supreme Court justice is appointed for life. And of course, we're talking about a lot of different bills that go through as to being constitutional or unconstitutional with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court being that balance of powers. So when a president is to appoint a Supreme Court justice, the whole country takes notice, because this gives the Supreme Court great power. So, and if it's a liberal judge, the way a liberal judge looks at the Constitution is totally different with what a conservative judge would look at the Constitution. So that's why when you see a Supreme Court justice being appointed, there's a lot of rigmarole to it, right? And examples we had, of course, was when President Reagan appointed Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, and then all these civil liberties groups got up, and People for the American Way and all these things, and they lobbied against his appointment, even though he got appointed. And then, of course, when President George Bush appointed, here's a picture of Clarence Thomas. This was he was opposed by liberals because he was conservative, had conservative views of the Constitution. So they put him through a terribly alleged trial of sexual harassment, saying that he had sexually harassed this woman. And when they got through the whole trial, there was no sufficient proof or evidence at all. So Clarence Thomas had to go through this horrific trial before he was allowed to be appointed as a Supreme Court justice. And this will happen a lot of times. They'll accuse people of things just to get the public to look at them differently. And a lot of times they're falsely accused, sometimes they're not, so, but in this case, he was finally approved without, or confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. So, so that we got to that point. Now also the president not only has the power of appointment, let's get up here, but the power of removal. So a president can remove someone from office too. So, except for impeachment, of course. The Constitution says nothing about how federal officers are to be removed from office, but in 1789, the first Congress, we're talking about under George Washington, provided the president could remove from office anyone seeking congressional approval or any officer whom he had the power to appoint, except for federal judges. So, basically is saying if George Washington appointed that person, George Washington should be able to remove that person, except for the judges, except for the justices, right? So since then, this has been kind of a controversy in many sense that a president who appoints someone can actually remove them. And they've tried to get rid of this, through the Constitution, but it hasn't been. And so, so anyway, the removal process, the president still has that, basically, that can remove someone that he's already approved of, So, limits in the president's power to remove appointment officials have come mostly from the courts, so. All right, so that was all on, first of all, we have, going back, the president is basically the head of state. He's the head executive. That's the whole executive power that we went through. All of those, basically the powers that he has. On to the next, we're going on to that he's also the chief legislator. So he's the head of state. He's the chief executive with all the powers that I went over, onto the chief legislator. So as the chief legislator, he's not part of the legislative branch. He's the executive branch, right? But the president seeks to influence the law and the lawmaking process. His most important power is to veto legislative bills. Veto is to disagree with them or send them back and say no to certain bills. But that power, the legislative power, actually extends even farther, because the president also can recommend legislation to Congress each year in a State of the Union address, and really tell Congress, what different laws and legislative goals that he's set, and what bills are more important than others. So the president has a major influence on the agenda of Congress, the issues that are considered and debated in Congress that coming year. So the president can say, we are going to talk about this issue in Congress, and we're going to debate it in Congress. So the president can point the most important issues and pick them out for for Congress, which Congress, of course, is the Senate and the House of Representatives, right? The president has power also to recommend legislation, and also has power to call special sessions of Congress when necessary together. So a president can recommend legislation. Basically, a president can veto legislation. A president can influence agenda, and a president can call special sessions if needed to on certain topics. But no president has ever called one house into session without the other house being there. And no president has ever exercised the power to adjourn Congress and say, Congress is now adjourned. No president has done that, ever. Even though a president has the power to adjourn Congress, adjourn Congress and say, okay, you're adjourned, go home. No president has ever done that. So that's the chief legislator. Okay, from chief legislator, let's go on here. Here, of course, it tells about the agenda, the issues. The president picks out the agenda. Chief diplomat. Okay. What's a diplomat? Foreign affairs are when foreign diplomats come. So a chief diplomat, our president, not only, let's go back, is the head of the state, dignitary, also to the chief executive, and also now to the chief legislator, and now to the chief diplomat. Number 4 is the chief diplomat. And this is most important in foreign affairs because the chief diplomat has the power to give national recognition to foreign countries, also to propose and ratify treaties, and to issue executive agreements. A lot of times this chief diplomat is also aided by his Secretary of State. His Secretary of State will come and help him as being the chief diplomat because the Secretary of State is usually out there as, an ambassador, right? So, chief diplomat is so important for foreign affairs. That's why you see presidents visiting other countries and talking to other countries as a diplomat. So, receives foreign diplomats, welcomes them as these people come into our country and extends diplomatic recognition to their nation. It's so important. If the president didn't recognize a nation, that maybe that nation would not be able to survive in the midst, especially having the United States recognized. So a lot of times, diplomatic recognition is so important for a nation. Recognize that nation exists and is a nation. It's the legitimacy of its government to a new nation, saying, yes, we recognize you as a new nation or as a nation, and we secure your existence and your legitimacy is important. This example that was given here was in 1903, Panama. The country of Panama revolted against the country of Colombia, and Theodore Roosevelt was president then, and he immediately extended his recognition and took steps so Panama could be an independent country and said Panama is a country. Well, he was building the Panama Canal, so he had some ideas that he really needed to have Panama as a country, but he took steps for Panama's independence. Also, a president may withhold diplomatic recognitions and not recognize that country. And this happened before as Communist China came into being. The presidents did not recognize Communist China as a country until President Nixon went and visited Communist China in 1972. And since the United States had refused to recognize Communist China, and Nixon did extend his good favor unto Communist China and recognized Communist China, this made it possible that Communist China could grow militarily and economically in the world. I don't know, I'm not going to say this is a good thing. Here's a picture of it, President Nixon in China as a diplomat, because I would not have ever wanted to recognize Communist China of all the horrific things, especially under Mao Zedong, underneath the communist regime was atrocious, but Nixon recognized them, and this made a difference. Also, I have to add here is under President Truman, recognizing Israel as a nation. His whole cabinet and his heads of the state and all in his White House, they all said, do not do this. This is going to cause a war in the Middle East, and it actually did. But he knew in recognizing that it was God's will, as recognizing Israel as a nation, was so important for America to do this. So this last part here talks about how to cut off. Well, it's not quite the last part. Let's go back here. How to cut off. Well, I guess it's written right here. It says how to cut off diplomatic relations. Number 1. So what can a president do to cut off relations with the country? First of all, he can declare, and it says here, he can declare what's called persona non grata, which means a person is not welcome. So he can declare diplomats are not welcome. So if diplomats declare a diplomatic representation is not welcome, persona non grata, you're not welcome, and request to be recalled by the government. Like, okay, you're coming here, but you're not welcome here. Go back to your nation. That's called persona non grata. So he can actually declare that. A president can. He also can call home our diplomats in a nation that we're under a war with, or there may become a war, precipitating war. So he can say, let's call our ambassadors home. So if we're going to war with a certain country, that he makes sure that his ambassadors and our diplomats are not stuck in that country at war. He calls them home, calling his ambassadors home. So those two things are important. In fact, example would be given here. President Woodrow Wilson on World War I with Germany in February 3rd of 1917. He sent home our the German ambassadors that were here. He sent back to Germany, and then he called our ambassadors back home, and war was declared 2 months later on April 6, 1917. So whenever you have that happen, when they're calling sending ambassadors back to their countries and calling them, you know that war is probably imminent, right? So basically, those are some things the president can do, especially in times of war. So also, treaties. We never talked about treaties. The president proposes treaties. So a president can enter treaties with foreign countries. This is a constitution, set in the Constitution in Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution says the president can enter into treaties with foreign nations and make treaties. But the president has to have 2/3 Senate majority vote. So the Senate has to approve, and 2/3 of the Senate has to approve a treaty. So treaties are made, but they have to be approved by quite a large percentage of the Senate, 2/3 of it. What is a treaty? A treaty is a formal agreement between nations, considered either bilateral between two nations, meaning bi, or multilateral between a lot of different nations. So it's a formal agreement between nations. The president is the dominant figure in the treaty, in the treaty making set by the Constitution, and 70% of time the president goes forth with the treaty, it's approved, historically approved by the Senate. So usually historically the Senate does approve. Some of the most famous are here. One of them, the most famous treaty to be signed in recent time, is called the START, S-T-A-R-T, which stands for Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And so this is multilateral between a lot of countries, between the United States, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, so onto, a few other nations now in that Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. So very important treaty. So there's an example also here of a treaty that has been the Senate refused to ratify it. The president sent forth a treaty and the Senate said no way. And this was Woodrow Wilson after World War I. So during the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles that was to end World War I, was a multilateral treaty over many countries in Europe at the end of World War I. And the United States Senate refused this treaty. Why? Because Woodrow Wilson presented his League of Nations. This is a predecessor of the United Nations. And he set forth the rules of the League of Nations, and the Senate did not approve of America being involved in the League, in this way, in the League of Nations, in the world power, as a one world government type setting of the League of Nations. So here President Woodrow Wilson set forth this elaborate Treaty of Versailles, and And all these countries did approve, but the United States Senate did not approve, and the League of Nations never was approved by the United States. Now later on, of course, came the United Nations, and of course that was approved a lot longer time down the road. So let's talk about, before the Commander-in-Chief, let's talk about the executive. An executive agreement is an informal agreement entered into by the president and the leader of a foreign nation or by their representatives. So what is the executive agreement? So this is informal. That means it doesn't have to be approved by the Senate, right? It's an informal agreement between a certain country, and our president and the leader of that foreign nation by their representatives. And this is quicker. An executive agreement is so much quicker than a treaty. A treaty takes a long time and has to be approved and go through the Senate, major times sometimes. And so basically executive agreement, just agreement between our president and the head of their country or their representative. And it doesn't require all this. And this has great influence and power on the diplomacy of the president to do this executive agreement. But of course, an executive agreement is not the same as a treaty, but it's looked on in high regard. So the last we're going to go over here, let's see, last we're going to go over is the Commander-in-Chief. So remember, what do we have? We have the president is the head of the state. He's the executive power of the state. He has on to the legislative power of the state. Let's see. On to the chief diplomat, and now into the Commander-in-Chief. 5 different things: chief of state, chief executive, chief legislator, chief diplomat, and now Commander-in-Chief. So let's talk about the Commander-in-Chief. Commander-in-Chief is related to that chief diplomat, as you can see. The Commander-in-Chief, though, is of the armed forces, and the Commander-in-Chief, this power is given again by the Constitution, and this is defense. Our defense system is ultimately in our president's hands, and he holds extensive military power. He controls military power, the forces of the federal government, and he may call out organized state militia like the National Guard, or may call out a militia when necessary. So Commander-in-Chief, he controls the military power, and he may call out more military power. And he uses this power for domestic peace in the nation, and also to protect our nation from foreign powers invading us from war. So basically, Commander-in-Chief to protect and maintain our peace in our country and outside of our country, right? As foreign powers try to attack us. The president delegates to the Defense Department and military leaders a lot of his power. So he doesn't just like, okay, I'm in command, I'm going to lead this army into war. No, he delegates it to those generals, he feels, and gives this to the Defense Department and the military leaders that know how to deal with military situations. But he may take direct control himself. George Washington did in the Whiskey Rebellion. George Washington stood up and he led the whole. Well, George Washington was used to leading as a general, leading in war, right, as a commander-in-chief. But a lot of presidents, of course, are not going to be out there like Napoleon leading his troops, Although a lot of presidents do visit the armed troops, do visit the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, encouraging our troops, right? So, to know here, there's some other important things. As Commander-in-Chief, here's some pictures here, though. Here's Obama, and he's doing a tour of Asia, and he's greeting soldiers there. And here we have Obama sent over to 1,000 National Guard troops to the United States-Mexico border. I mean, it's actually happening kind of now. So let's go on to the next. So on to this, only Congress can appropriate funds for armed forces. Although the president can basically appoint, as the leaders of foreign, only Congress can bring in the funding, right? And only Congress can declare war. I mean, the president can send troops into combat. He can send the troops into combat with official declaration of war, but it has to go through Congress, and Congress has to declare war. In war times, Congress grants the president more extensive power than peace times. We found that especially in World War II during FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president. He was given a lot of power as the commander in chief in this area, and given more power even by Congress because it was times of war. And now in a nuclear age, it's very important that the president has power during this age, because what if someone we knew that was sending over a nuclear warhead to blow us up? Well, we need to make a decision right away to press that button, or what to do to be able to hit that nuclear weapon in air so it won't get us, right? Which we can. So in the nuclear age, it's so important the president has the power to take aggressive military action without waiting. Okay, we have to wait for Congress to get in session and the Senate to approve this. They have to be able to say on the blink of an eye, to be able to say, okay, we're in war, or we gotta do something. There's nuclear warheads coming, or we need to make a decision. So president's given power to make those split decisions in war. So, in fact, here is something is Congress passed what's called the War Powers Resolution. So it says here, however, this is pretty important. It says, however, let's see, some have become concerned that the recent presidents have become too independent of Congress in their military powers. As a result of the United States' long involvement in Vietnam War, which was fought without congressional declaration of war, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which was designed to limit from 60 to 90 days the time a president could keep American forces involved in a foreign conflict without the approval of Congress. So, and the Vietnam War went on and on and on, and Congress never did approve of the Vietnam War, and it went on years. And so they set forth, before they had no limit on that, and now we have the War Powers Resolution of 1973 that set a limit that Congress would need to approve before you can declare a war going on, as Vietnam War went on without approval of the Congress. I never knew that. That was, something that was really, really important to know, because Vietnam went on because of, the powers of the presidency and such, them through few different presidents too, without Congress approving of declaring war in Vietnam, So let's finish your section review here. So, list the 5 primary roles of the president. I went over and over those 5 roles. First of all, the chief of state, that's putting forth the dignitaries and putting forth chief of state, doing the State of the Union address, the inauguration and such, being like that picture of a king or queen, or those. Not when I say that, you can't really say monarchy, but in that type of position. And then the chief executive, which having all the executive powers of appointments that we went over. Chief legislator, being able to veto legislations and recommend legislation of laws, right? Legislation being laws. Chief diplomat, basically to put forth treaties and send diplomats back, or recognize nations and foreign nations. Diplomat has to do with foreign nations. And on to commander-in-chief during wartime. Those are the 5 different things we need to know. What are 3 ceremonial functions of the president as chief of state? Well, we went over that. The inauguration, remember when he's inaugurated, puts his hand in the Bible and he becomes president, inaugurated as president. The State of the Union address is what he basically talks about as being president. The State of the Union address is directed towards Congress. And also receiving dignitaries, like having people from other countries and nations coming and visiting the White House, let's say. Receiving dignitaries. Number 3, according to the 20th Amendment, when is the presidential inauguration to take place? January 20th. 1933 is when the 20th Amendment, just think of the 20th Amendment, 20th of January at noon. So, number 4, what are the president's powers as chief executive? We went through those powers. Ordinance powers is those powers that they can be carried out without Senate approval. Those are executive power or ordinance power. The power to seek advice of the cabinet. He can seek the cabinet's advice. Power to pardon somebody of a crime, and on the national or federal level. Pardoning power. Power of appointment, to appoint a lot of different people, including Supreme Court justices. And the power of removal, to remove those that he's appointed. So 5 different powers, the chief executive. So what powers does the president possess as chief legislative? Well, those powers as chief legislator, of course, would be, first of all, the power to veto bills. Veto bills, also recommend legislation on the State of the Union. Basically also to call special sessions or adjourn sessions, call Congress, recommend agenda in Congress to be discussed. Those things are very important. Number 6, what was the most famous treaty signed in recent times? The START, Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, and that was with Russia and communist nations and such in 1992. Okay, that's one of the most. What is the most famous? Name the most famous treaty Congress refused to pass. That was the Treaty of Versailles. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson wanted to push through the League of Nations, and the Senate would not ratify that treaty at all because of the setting forth the League of Nations. They were debating that should America be involved in the League of Nations in Europe. Number 7. As Commander-in-Chief, what military forces may the President call upon in times of crisis? Well, in times of crisis, he may call upon the National Guard or the militia to come out during the. So he may also call out, the military, but also militia, which would be the National Guard. That's formed. So that's about it for going over the president. We have one more little section on the president, and also I wanted to go over a section on the Bible scriptures how the different presidents in history have, what they've thought of the Bible. I thought that was very interesting. So we'll do that in our next video.